The image of France presented to the world is one of effortless, light-filled liberty. It is the silhouette of a café chair on a Haussmann boulevard, the drape of a silk scarf, and the unyielding defense of the individual's right to be difficult. This is the France of the tourist brochure and the philosophical tract, a nation held up as the westernmost bastion of liberal expression. Yet if one peels back the elegant limestone of the Place de la Concorde and descends into the subterranean machinery of the state, a different reality emerges. Beneath the veneer of the free market lies a structural skeleton that bears a striking, albeit sophisticated, resemblance to the Gosplan of the Soviet era. While the rest of the Western world spent the latter half of the 20th century retreating from the heights of the state-managed economy, France doubled down on a uniquely Gallic form of central planning known as dirigisme. This was not the clumsy, brutalist command economy of the Eastern Bloc, but a refined, intellectualized version of the same dream, the belief that a small, enlightened elite could and should choreograph the destiny of a nation. In 1945, France was not merely a country in ruins, it was a nation whose collective psyche had been shattered by the collapse of 1940 and the subsequent years of occupation. The spirit of the times was defined by a profound, pervasive distrust of the old liberal order that had failed to stop the Panzer divisions. Driven by this existential trauma, the post-war provisional government, led by Charles de Gaulle, reached a silent consensus that the market was too fickle to be trusted with the survival of the republic. Consequently, the state was reimagined not just as a referee, but as the primary social architect. The ledger of the 1946 Monet Plan, its edges yellowed by the tobacco smoke of the newly formed Commissariat Général du Plan, recorded a vision that was less a budget and more a secular scripture. Jean Monnet, the mastermind behind this reconstruction, viewed the economy as a machine that required a single steady hand at the throttle. Inevitably, this led to the nationalization of the banks, the mines, and the electricity providers, turning the French state into the largest employer and the sole financier of the nation's future. The forensic evidence of this transformation is found in the meticulous records of the École Nationale d'Administration, or ENA. Founded in the immediate aftermath of the war, this institution was designed to produce a new breed of secular priest, the anarch. These were the men and women trained to believe that the complexities of human desire and market fluctuation could be reduced to elegant mathematical models. In a narrow office overlooking the Seine in 1962, a man named Henri, a junior graduate of the ENA, adjusted his spectacles as he reviewed a map of the Rhône Valley. Before him lay a landscape not of soil and memory, but a grid of caloric output and logistical throughput. With a single stroke of a fountain pen, he could authorize the displacement of an entire village to make way for a hydroelectric dam, convinced that his mandate from the state superseded the messy reality of local consent. This was the human face of dirigisme, a quiet, high-collared certainty that the collective good was a technical problem waiting for a bureaucratic solution. This period, known as the Trente Glorieuses, saw France achieve growth rates that rivaled the German miracle across the Rhine. However, the mechanism was fundamentally different. While Germany embraced the social market, France embraced the plan. To the casual observer, the rise of the TGV, or the rapid expansion of the nuclear energy program, the Mesmer Plan of 1974, seemed like triumphs of Gallic ingenuity. In reality, they were the products of a command structure that bypassed the market entirely. The state decided that France would be a nuclear power. Consequently, it became one, regardless of the initial cost or public hesitation. The statistical reality of this era is staggering when compared to the Anglo-American trajectory. By the late 1970s, while Margaret Thatcher was preparing to dismantle the British state, French public spending was climbing towards 50% of the national GDP. The state was no longer merely providing services, it was the lungs through which the hexagon breathed. The fragility of this model was exposed in the spring of 1981, following the election of François Mitterrand. In a final grand attempt to fulfill the dream of a state-managed utopia, the socialist government embarked on a massive wave of nationalizations, bringing 39 banks and 5 major industrial groups under direct government control. For a moment, it appeared that Paris would succeed where Moscow had failed, creating a prosperous, high-tech command economy. Had the global oil markets remained stable, or had the franc not come under immediate speculative attack, the French experiment might have continued its divergence from the West indefinitely. But the reality of global capital was a cold shower. In March 1983, faced with a collapsing currency and soaring inflation, Mitterrand was forced to perform le tournant de la rigueur, the turn to austerity. This was the moment the dream of a pure state-led utopia theoretically died, yet the skeleton of the system remained remarkably intact. The paradox of modern France is that while it participates in the globalized market, its internal logic remains deeply dirigiste. Even today, public spending in France hovers near 56% of GDP, the highest in the Eurozone, and significantly higher than the 44% average of its neighbors. This is not merely a matter of social welfare, it is a philosophical commitment to the state as the ultimate guarantor of social cohesion. The relationship between the citizen and the state is not a contract, but a covenant. When the French people take to the streets in protest, as they did during the Yellow Vest movement, they are not protesting against the state's interference, they are protesting its perceived abandonment of its role as the provider. They demand more state, not less, reflecting a psychological dependency that was forged in the fires of 1945. Ultimately, the Cold War did not end with the total victory of laissez-faire capitalism. It merely saw the collapse of its most dysfunctional practitioner. In the corridors of the Ministry of Finance at Berquet, the ghost of the Gosplan survives in the form of industrial policy and state-backed champions. The belief that the state must act as the primary social architect is as potent today as it was in the days of de Gaulle. The TGV trains that streak across the countryside and the nuclear reactors that hum in the dark are monuments to a time when France decided that the future was too important to be left to the people who would live in it. The border between the state and the individual, drawn in those drafty post-war offices by candlelight, still defines the boundaries of the French soul today. The hexagon remains a paradox, a land of individual liberty governed by a collective machine, a nation that looks like the West but thinks like a plan. In the quiet, rhythmic thud of a bureaucrat's stamp in a Parisian office, one can still hear the heartbeat of an era that the rest of the world thinks has passed.
The winter of 1944 did not arrive with the celebrated clarity of liberation, but rather in a suffocating shroud of gray ash and frozen mud. France was a skeleton of a nation, its ribcage of railways shattered and its lungs of industry choked by 4 years of systematic plunder. In the cafes of Paris, the air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the deeper, more pervasive scent of a collective identity crisis. The Third Republic had not merely fallen, it had evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum that the old guard of merchant capitalism was too discredited to fill. Driven by this profound sense of systemic failure, the French psyche shifted from a nostalgic defense of the small-scale artisan to a desperate hunger for the monumental. There was a growing unspoken consensus that the pre-war era of Malthusian economics, a cautious, stagnant refusal to expand, was the true architect of the 1940 defeat. To survive in a world now dominated by the raw industrial mass of the Americans and the Soviets, France would have to do more than rebuild. It would have to reinvent the very concept of the state. The psychological landscape of 1945 was defined by a rejection of the notaire culture, the cautious, dividend-seeking bourgeoisie who had preferred stability to growth. Consequently, the provisional government under Charles de Gaulle found itself presiding over a nation that was, for the first time in its modern history, in love with the idea of the future rather than the sanctity of the past. It was in this atmosphere of radical pragmatism that Jean Monnet emerged. Monet was not a man of the barricades or the ballot box, but a man of the ledger and the logistics chain. Having spent the war years in Washington observing the titanic output of the American arsenal of democracy, he returned to Paris with a terrifyingly simple conviction. Modernization was not an option, but a terminal ultimatum. He famously warned that France faced a choice between modernization or decadence, and in the scorched earth of the post-war reality, decadence looked very much like national extinction. Inevitably, this realization led to the creation of the Commissariat Général du Plan in January 1946. It was housed not in a sprawling ministry, but in a modest townhouse at 18 Rue de Martignac, a choice that reflected Monet's desire for a lean nerve center rather than a bloated bureaucracy. Here, a small circle of technocrats, men who would become known as the monks of the plan, began to draft the blueprint for a new France. They operated with a surgical detachment, viewing the nation's economy as a single integrated machine that had been allowed to rust. Their primary tool was the inductive plan, a mechanism where the state did not seize the means of production in the Soviet sense, but instead dictated the flow of credit and resources with such overwhelming gravity that the private sector had no choice but to follow. By prioritizing 6 basic sectors — coal, electricity, steel, cement, agricultural machinery, and transport — the planners ensured that the foundations of the house were poured before anyone even considered the wallpaper of consumer goods. Evidence of this forensic transformation can be found in the granular records of the first Monet Plan, where every ton of coal from the Lorraine basins was tracked with an obsessive detail of a military campaign. In the archives, one can find a memorandum from a junior surveyor in the Rhone Valley, dating October 1947, describing the total absence of viable machinery and the reliance on human hands to move mountains of silt. This surveyor, a man named Henry who had spent 3 years in a German labor camp, wrote of the strange silent fervor of his crew as they broke ground on the Donzère-Mondragon Dam. To Henry and his men, the pouring of concrete was not merely a job, it was an act of purification, a way to wash away the stain of the occupation with the roar of a hydroelectric turbine. This was the microbiography of the plan. Thousands of individuals like Henry, who saw in the cold geometry of infrastructure a form of national redemption that politics had failed to provide. The fragility of this entire project cannot be overstated, for history is often decided by the narrowest of margins. Had the French Communist Party, which held immense power in the immediate post-war years, chosen to sabotage the plan in favor of a more radical, disruptive revolution, the Monet miracle would have been strangled in its cradle. Or, perhaps more critically, had the United States decided that a resurgent state-led French economy was a threat to its own liberal trade interests, the vital flow of Marshall Plan dollars could have been diverted. There was a specific Tuesday in early 1948 when the shipment of American-made tractors to the ports of Le Havre was nearly canceled due to a diplomatic spat over the administration of the Ruhr. Had those ships turned back, the mechanization of French agriculture would have been delayed by a decade, potentially triggering a food crisis that would have toppled the fragile Fourth Republic and returned France to the chaos of the 1930s. Instead, the alignment of American capital and French technocracy created a feedback loop of unprecedented power. The state assumed the role of the ultimate entrepreneur, absorbing the risks that private bankers were too terrified to take. This shift from traditional capitalism to state-managed modernization was not merely a change in policy, but a change in the French soul. The 30 glorious years of expansion were rooted in this moment when the state became the pulse of the nation. The legitimacy of the government was no longer tied to its defense of tradition, but to its ability to increase the gross national product by 5% every year. The citizen was increasingly viewed as a producer-consumer within a grand national project, a cog in a machine that was finally, after decades of stalling, beginning to hum with terrifying efficiency. As the 1950s dawned, the results were visible in the skyline of every major city and the electrification of the farthest rural hamlet. The General Planning Commission had succeeded in turning a traumatized agricultural society into a technocratic powerhouse. This was the birth of the dirigiste philosophy, the belief that the state is the only actor capable of long-term vision in a world of short-term chaos. The architects of the plan had built more than just bridges and steel mills. They had built a template for the modern European state. Today, the echoes of the Rue de Martignac are found in the high-speed rail lines that stitch the continent together and the massive aerospace conglomerates that challenge global rivals. The deliberate surgical intervention of 1946 established a precedent that still dictates how France responds to crisis by looking not to the market, but to the plan. The ruins of 1944 are gone, but the scaffolding of the state-led world they necessitated remains the invisible skeleton of the modern French identity.
In the cooling embers of 1945, France was less a nation than a cartographic ghost, its infrastructure shattered and its institutional memory scarred by the paralysis of the Third Republic. Driven by the stinging realization that the 1940 collapse was as much a failure of administration as of arms, the provisional government under Charles de Gaulle issued the Ordinance of October 9, 1945. This was the birth of the École Nationale d'Administration, an institution designed not merely to educate, but to forge a secular priesthood of the state. These new men, the anarchs, were the vanguard of a radical psychological shift in the French psyche. The era of the fragmented local notable was over, replaced by a collective belief in the infallible, centralizing power of the rational mind. In the cramped, drafty lecture halls of the Rue des Saint-Père, the air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco and the heavy, intoxicating weight of destiny. These students were taught that the state was the only entity capable of transcending the selfish whims of the market and the chaotic impulses of the populace. Consequently, the government was no longer viewed as a referee between competing interests, but as the sole architect of the common good, a perspective that would define the next 4 decades of French life. This centralized intellectual authority created a unified ruling class that shared not only a curriculum, but a private vocabulary of power. By the 1950s, the graduates of the Grand Écoles had infiltrated every capillary of the French bureaucracy, forming what became known as the Grand Corps. This was the era of the plan, a series of 5-year blueprints that treated the French economy like a vast, complex engine to be tuned by experts. The psychological context of this period was one of supreme, almost clinical confidence. The technocrats believed that if a problem could be measured, it could be solved.
Inevitably, this led to a culture where dissent was viewed not as a democratic right, but as a technical error to be corrected. Consider a young administrator in 1958, his fingers stained with the purple ink of official stamps, sitting beneath the high ceilings of the Ministry of Finance. He would spend 14 hours a day drafting decrees that would reorganize entire agricultural sectors, convinced that his spreadsheets held more truth than the protests of the farmers whose lives he was rewriting. To him, the individual was a data point in a grand trajectory of national modernization, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of progress. The fragility of this grand design was nearly exposed during the global turmoil of the late 1960s, which threatened to fracture the technocratic consensus. Had the student uprisings of May 1968 succeeded in dismantling the hierarchical structures of the state, the massive industrial projects that followed might never have materialized. However, the technocracy did not break. It adapted, absorbing the shock and doubling down on its commitment to large-scale, state-led development. The 1973 oil crisis served as the ultimate catalyst for this resolve. While other Western nations scrambled to mitigate the shock through market adjustments, the French state reacted with the Mesmer Plan of 1974. Named after Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer, this was a decree of breathtaking audacity, mandating the total nuclearization of the French energy grid. It was an engineering feat that ignored the rising tide of environmentalism and the fluctuations of global capital. Because the technocrats held the levers of both the state's regulatory apparatus and its primary utility providers, they were able to authorize the construction of 56 nuclear reactors in less than 2 decades. This was not a response to public demand, but a command issued from the top, executed with a level of logistical precision that only a unified elite could command. This same ruthlessness was applied to the modernization of the French rail network. In the late 1960s, the SNCF, the state-owned railway, was a bleeding wound on the national budget. Yet the technocrats saw not a liability, but an opportunity for a grand symbolic gesture of French engineering. The development of the TGV, the train à grande vitesse, was characterized by a forensic obsession with speed and reliability. On the morning of February 26, 1981, a prototype train reached a world record speed of 380 kilometers per hour on a stretch of track in the Morwan. This was more than a technical achievement. It was a demonstration of the state's ability to compress time and space. The TGV did not just connect Paris to Lyon. It subordinated the provinces to the capital, making the entire nation a suburb of the central authority. The orange skin of the first TGV sets became the visual shorthand for a France that was outpacing the world, a nation where the state could manifest its will in steel and electricity. Yet, as the state's industrial triumphs grew, the boundary between the public sector and private industry began to dissolve into a shadowy gray zone known as pantaflous. This practice, where high-ranking civil servants would slip on the slippers of corporate leadership, created a closed loop of power. By the 1980s, the CEOs of France's largest firms, from energy giants to telecommunications firms, were almost exclusively drawn from the same pool of énarques and polytechniques who had previously regulated them. This blurring of lines meant that the state was no longer just the architect of the economy, but its primary shareholder and manager. The forensic reality of this era is found in the minutes of board meetings in the 1980s, where the language used to discuss corporate profit was indistinguishable from the language of administrative law. The goal was no longer the health of the market, but the preservation of the national champion. This created a rigid hierarchy where merit was defined by one's rank in a graduation list decades prior, a system that favored stability over innovation. The legacy of this technocratic era remains etched into the very fabric of modern France, from the ubiquitous cooling towers of the Loire Valley to the sleek, silent lines of the TGV stations. The secular priesthood succeeded in creating a modern, efficient, and technologically advanced state, but they did so at the cost of a profound and growing estrangement between the governed and the governed. The belief that a small group of experts could define the common good for 60 million people created a social architecture that was as impressive as it was brittle. Today, the resentment toward the elite that bubbles over in French streets is the direct inheritance of the 1945 ordinance. The same centralized power that allowed France to build the world's most advanced rail and energy networks also built a wall of administrative distance that remains unbreached. The anarchs succeeded in their mission to rebuild the machinery of the state, but in making the machine so perfect, they forgot that a nation is made of people, not just components. The shadow of the Grande Écoles still falls across the Palais d'Élysée, a reminder that the rule of the experts, once established, is almost impossible to dismantle.
The arrival of 1981 in France was not merely a change in administration, it was the onset of a psychological fever that gripped the Republic, a belief that the very foundations of the social contract could be rewritten by legislative fiat. To walk through the streets of Paris in May of that year was to witness a collective inhalation, a sense that the decades-old Gaullist consensus had finally fractured to make way for a rupture with capitalism. François Mitterrand's victory brought with it the Common Programme, a radical blueprint that sought to anchor the French economy within the grasp of the state. Driven by this ideological momentum, the new government moved with a speed that bordered on the reckless, viewing the private sector not as a partner, but a frontier to be conquered and civilized. The air in the planning offices of the Rue de Bercy was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the heat of mimeograph machines, as civil servants worked late into the night to draft the nationalization laws of February 1982. They believed they were not just seizing assets, but reclaiming the national destiny from the perceived chaos of the market. Inevitably, the scale of this ambition triggered a forensic chain of consequences that the Élysée had failed to fully simulate. The state took control of 36 major banks and 5 of the nation's industrial pillars, including Pechiney-Eugene Kuhlmann, Rhône-Poulenc, and Saint-Gobain. In the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of these giants, the transition was marked by a quiet, sterile tension. A junior auditor at the Banque de France, perhaps 26 years old, and wearing a stiff-collared shirt that felt too tight in the humid spring of 1982, sat hunched over a ledger, watching as the capital flight began in earnest. He saw the numbers move before the politicians did, a steady, rhythmic pulse of francs being converted into marks and dollars, fleeing a country that seemed determined to isolate itself behind a wall of state ownership. This was the forensic reality of the frontier. For every factory the state saved, the international markets exacted a price in the form of a weakening currency. The collective psychological state shifted from the euphoria of the Bastille celebrations to a mounting, unspoken anxiety as inflation began to erode the very wages the government had promised to protect. Consequently, by the winter of 1982, the French model found itself in a state of direct friction with the reality of the European monetary system. The franc fort policy was no longer a matter of pride, but a desperate struggle for survival. The state was attempting to fund a massive expansion of social services and industrial subsidies, while its tax base was shrinking and its trade deficit was widening to a cavernous degree. Had Mitterrand chosen at this moment to listen to the radical wing of his party and exit the European monetary system entirely, France might have drifted into a protectionist autarky, becoming a stagnant island in a rapidly globalizing ocean. The tension was palpable in the halls of power.
A single decision in a late-night meeting could have severed France's ties to the nascent European project. Instead, the Tour de la Rigueur, or the turn to austerity in 1983, emerged as a strategic retreat of such significance that it redefined the French state for the next half-century. It was a moment where the dream of a socialist utopia was sacrificed on the altar of European integration and fiscal sanity. This pivot was not a total surrender to the market, but rather the birth of a hybrid system, a state that remained deeply interventionist even as it learned to speak the language of the liberalized continental market. The friction moved from the currency markets to the regulatory chambers of Brussels. The French state fought tenaciously to maintain its national champions, using every loophole in European competition law to funnel subsidies into industries it deemed essential to the national identity. At a Renault plant in Billancourt, a veteran welder who had spent 20 years on the line found himself caught in this transition. He was told his job was safe because the state owned the factory, yet he watched as the assembly line was slowed by restructuring directives that felt suspiciously like the corporate downsizing he had been promised would never happen under a socialist banner. He was a microbiography of the era's contradiction, a man protected by a state that was simultaneously being forced to dismantle the very protections it had just built. As the mid-1980s progressed, the conflict between French dirigisme and the European Union's drive for deregulation became the defining struggle of the decade. The state's insistence on protecting its national champions, Airbus, the STV, and the nuclear energy sector, created a unique economic landscape where the state acted as both the referee and the lead player. This period saw the survival of these national champions through a complex web of state-guaranteed loans and strategic protectionism that frequently drew the ire of the European Commission. The friction was constant and grinding. Every attempt from Brussels to open the French telecommunications or energy markets was met with a sophisticated bureaucratic insurgency from Paris. The French elite, many of whom were educated at the elite École Nationale d'Administration, viewed the state not as an obstacle to growth, but as the only legitimate engine of it. They believed without the state's guiding hand, the French economy would be swallowed by the faceless forces of Anglo-American finance. Ultimately, the legacy of this 1980s friction remains the defining characteristic of modern France. The turn to austerity did not kill the interventionist spirit, it merely forced it to evolve. The state learned to project power through a dirigisme of the possible, balancing national pride with the cold requirements of a shared currency. The border drawn in those 1983 cabinet meetings between the desire for total control and the necessity of international cooperation divides the French political landscape today. When a modern French president intervenes to prevent a foreign takeover of a domestic energy firm or pours billions into a state-led green energy initiative, they are channeling the ghost of the 1981 nationalizations and the 1983 retreat. The friction of the frontier never truly ended. It simply moved into the machinery of the modern European state, where the ghost of the state as savior continues to haunt the halls of a liberalized market. The 1,000-word trajectory of this decade proves that history is rarely a clean break, but rather a series of compromises etched in the ledger of necessity.
The shadow of the French state does not merely fall across the landscape, it is the landscape itself. A silent, omnipresent architecture that has outlasted kings, emperors, and 5 republics. To walk through a provincial French town is to witness a civilization where the mairie stands not as a mere administrative building, but as a secular cathedral, the physical manifestation of a social contract that remains the most resilient in the Western world. While the Anglo-American consensus of the late 20th century sought to retreat from the lives of its citizens, dismantling the machinery of the public sector in favor of market efficiency, France moved in the opposite direction.
Driven by a deep-seated historical trauma of fragmentation and external threat, the French people forged an identity tied inextricably to the État, viewing the central authority not as a necessary evil, but as the sole guarantor of liberty and equality. This was never a choice made in a vacuum. It was the inevitable consequence of a history where the state predated the nation, a top-down construction that hammered a collection of disparate regions and dialects into a single, unified entity. The roots of this obsession with central authority reach back to the reign of Louis XIV, whose finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, established the doctrine of dirigisme. In the 17th century, the state did not merely regulate the economy, it created it, founding royal manufactures and establishing a bureaucracy that could project the king's will into the furthest corners of the hexagon. This legacy of state-led development was not swept away by the Revolution of 1789. Instead, it was perfected. Napoleon Bonaparte replaced the chaotic patchwork of feudal privileges with a streamlined, hierarchical administrative structure, placing a prefect in every department to act as the eyes and ears of Paris. Consequently, the French citizen became accustomed to a life where the state provided the roads, the education, the law, and the very definition of what it meant to be French. By the time the industrial age arrived, the template for the eternal state was already hardened. In the minds of the 19th century populace, the state was the only force capable of taming the volatile forces of modernity, a psychological anchor in an era of rapid and often violent change. This collective psychological state reached its zenith in the aftermath of the Second World War. In 1945, France was a nation physically shattered and morally exhausted, its infrastructure in ruins, and its soul scarred by collaboration and defeat. In the freezing winters of the late 1940s, the French public did not merely want reconstruction, they craved a structure that would ensure they would never be vulnerable again. The National Council of the Resistance, a disparate group of communists, Gaullists, and socialists, reached a historic consensus. The state would own the banks, the mines, the electricity, and the transport systems. This was the birth of the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of state-led growth that transformed a rural agrarian society into a global industrial powerhouse. During this era, the Commissariat Général du Plan became the most powerful office in the country, staffed by a new elite of hauts fonctionnaires trained in the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration. These men, known as the énarques, viewed the economy as a problem of engineering rather than a marketplace of ideas. One can find the forensic evidence of this era in the blueprints of the TGV, the high-speed rail network that began as a state-sponsored dream in the late 1960s. While Britain was debating the privatization of its railways, French engineers were given a blank check and a national mandate to conquer distance. The resulting network, which today hums with the vibration of a vision that predates the internet, is a monument to the belief that the state can achieve what the private sector cannot. However, this model faced its greatest existential threat in the early 1980s. When François Mitterrand was elected in 1981, he attempted a radical expansion of the state, nationalizing major industrial groups and raising social benefits. Within 2 years, the experiment faced a brutal collision with global financial reality. Capital fled the country, and the franc plummeted. Had the socialist government of 1983 persisted in its radical isolation, France might have broken entirely from the European project. Inevitably, Mitterrand was forced into the tournant de la rigueur, or the turn towards austerity. Yet, even in retreat, the French state refused to surrender its core identity. It accepted the market, but it never embraced it. To understand the human cost and the human necessity of this system, one must look towards a figure like Jean-Pierre, a minor municipal official in a dying industrial village in the Moselle.
In the 1990s, as the steel mills closed and the private sector vanished, Jean-Pierre's office became the last outpost of civilization. He did not just process paperwork, he ensured the local school remained open, that the elderly received their state-guaranteed pensions, and that the bus link to the nearest city was maintained at a loss. For Jean-Pierre, the state was not a column of figures on a balance sheet. It was the only thing standing between his community and the abyss of total neglect. This microbiography of service is repeated in thousands of communes across the country, creating a social fabric that is remarkably dense and at times incredibly rigid. The price of this protection is a tax-to-GDP ratio that remains among the highest in the developed world, a burden that critics argue stifles innovation and creates a permanent class of the unemployed. The tension of the modern era is found in the Gilets jaunes protests, where the peripheral citizens of France rose up not against the state, but against a state they felt had abandoned them. They did not want less government, they wanted the eternal state to return to its original promise of protection. Today, France stands as a singular anomaly in a neoliberal world, maintaining a public sector that accounts for over half of its annual economic output. While its neighbors have privatized their health services and deregulated their labor markets, France remains a bastion of state-managed society. The legacy of the Bourbon kings, the Napoleonic prefects, and the post-war planners lives on in the sheer scale of the French administrative machine. It is a system that offers a provocative counter-narrative to the global consensus, the idea that a nation is not merely a market, but a collective project that requires a powerful central arbiter to survive. This persistent reliance on the state is a deep-seated cultural identity, rooted in the belief that only the central authority can protect the citizen from the volatility of the global age. The TGV tracks, the centralized school curriculum, and the universal healthcare system are the modern iterations of a dream that began centuries ago in the halls of Versailles. In an age of fragmentation, France remains the last enduring state, a nation where the État is not just a provider of services, but the very soul of the people.
Rest assured, madam, your pension is secured. It will be deposited on the 1st of each month.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate your help.